Welcome back. Today we will be reading this book entitled Hanged, Mary Surratt and the Plot to Assassinate Abraham Lincoln. The author is Sarah Miller. Let's take a look at what this book is about. It says, once the most hated woman in the United States, Mary Surratt is now all but forgotten. Who was she? The simplest answer, a mother, a Catholic, a widow, a landlady. But that is far from the whole story. For Mary Surratt's, Washington, D.C.'s boardinghouse is among the locations where John Wilkes Booth and his allies, including Mary's own son, are known to have gathered to plot the murder of Abraham Lincoln. 150 years ago, a grieving, furious nation confronted the question of whether Miss Surratt committed treason by aiding and abetting Booth and his conspiracy to assassinate the president and upend the government. Was she, as the Vice President Andrew Johnson put it, the woman who kept the nest that hatched the egg? Or was she merely the victim of a spectacularly cruel coincidence? From acclaimed author Sarah Miller comes nonfiction at its very best, action packed, thought provoking, and steeped in thorny questions about guilt, innocence, and the meaning of justice. So today we are going to start this book and read a few chapters today. We're going to read chapters 1 through 3. Chapter 1, Washington City, April 15th, 1865. It was 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning when the bell of Mary Surratt's boarding house at 541 H Street rang very violently. On the third floor 22-year-old Louis Weichman, a former college chum of Mary's younger son, roused himself from bed. After pulling on a pair of pants under his nightshirt, he ran barefooted down the stairs. Weichman did not open the door immediately. Wary of middle-of-the-night visitors, he tapped on the inside of the front door to let whoever had clanged the bell know they should stop. Who is there? Weichman asked. Government officers come to search the house of John Wilkes Booth and John Surratt, came the prompt reply. Louis Weichman had seen John Wilkes Booth, one of the most famous actors in America, that very afternoon. Booth had stopped by to speak with Miss Surratt just before Weichman had driven her into the countryside on an errand. However, Weichman and Booth's mutual friend, Mary's son, John Surratt Jr., had left for Canada over a week before. Through the closed door, Weichman informed the officers that neither of the men they sought was inside. Let us in anyhow, the voices outside demanded. We want to search the house. But it was not his house. Weichman was only a boarder, renting his bed and eating his meals in Miss Surratt's dining room. He could not let a group of unknown men into a lady's home in the middle of the night without her permission, and Weichman told them so. The officers waited on the porch while Weichman hurried down the hall and past the parlor to Mary Surratt's bedroom door. Another boarder, 17-year-old Honora Fitzpatrick, who shared a bed with Miss Surratt, had also been awakened by the clanging doorbell. Now she heard Weichman's gentle knock and his voice calling softly through the door. Miss Surratt, there are detectives who have come to search the house and would like to search your room. Honora Fitzpatrick and Louis Weichman would remember vastly different reactions from their landlady, so contradictory in tone and manner, and in fact it seemed they might have been in the presence of 2 different women. One of Mary's young boarders reported her reply thus: Mr. Weichman, ask them to wait a few minutes and I will open the door for them. The other would insist for decades afterward that she had said, for God's sake, let them come in. I expected a house to be searched. At that moment, this detail mattered little. Whatever Mary Surratt's response, the officers were admitted, 6 or 8 of them, as Louis Weichman remembered it. There were men stationed in front of the house and men in the alley behind it. Two detectives went directly to the attic, where Mary Surratt's daughter and teenage niece shared a room. Before Weichman had time to dress, two more men went into his room and peered under the bed and into the closet, and then began examining everything else in sight. For God's sake, gentlemen, what means this search of the house so early in the morning? Weichman implored. The young man's confusion startled the officers. Do you pretend to tell me, sir, that you do not know what has happened last night? One of them asked. Louis Weichman insisted that he was completely bewildered. I will tell you, said one of them. Metropolitan Police Detective John Clarvo, and he drew a crimson-stained piece of cravat from his pocket. Do you see that blood? Clarvo asked, brandishing the torn necktie. That is Abraham Lincoln's blood. John Wilkes Booth has murdered Abraham Lincoln, and John Surratt has assassinated the Secretary of State. Stunned into momentary silence, Louis Weichman followed the two detectives back downstairs and arrived just as Mary Surratt was emerging from her room. What do you think, Miss Surratt? Weichman said. President Lincoln had been murdered by John Wilkes Booth, and the Secretary of State has been assassinated. Mary Surratt threw up her hands in astonishment. Oh, my God, Mr. Weichman, you don't tell me so, she exclaimed. Chapter 2. 4 hours earlier, Abraham Lincoln had been seated in the president's box in Ford's Theater, chuckling at a line of the comedy Our American Cousin, when a 44 caliber lead ball fired from a single shot Derringer pistol smashed into the left side of his skull and bored its way through the center of his brain. The revolver's abrupt report startled the actors, who knew there were no gunshots in this production. The audience, however, did not immediately react. The play had already been interrupted once by President Lincoln's own arrival at the theater 20 minutes after the curtain had lifted. One of the actors on stage had improvised a line to alert the theater to the president's entrance. This reminds me of a story, as Mr. Lincoln says. Understanding this impromptu cue, the orchestra launched into a rendition of Hail to the Chief as Abraham Lincoln, his wife Mary, and their guest, Major Henry Rathbone, and Miss Clara Harris made their way to the box that had been specially furnished and decorated in the president's honor. The spectators treated Lincoln as a hero to a hero's welcome. After 4 years of a war of cost of over 650,000 American lives, Confederate General Robert E. Lee had finally surrendered the Army of Northern Virginia to General Ulysses S. Grant on April 9th. Abraham Lincoln had preserved the Union just as he had promised to do. President Lincoln acknowledged the standing ovation and voracious cheering. With a bow, then settled into a rocking chair in a corner of his flag-draped box to indulge in a long overdue evening of derision. Miss Lincoln rested her hand on his knee much of the time, one theater goer noticed, and often called his attention to some humorous situation on the stage. She seemed to take great pleasure in witnessing his enjoyment. Now seeing a flash and hearing a crack like fireworks, the audience waited to discover what additional surprises might be in store. Indeed, a special song had been composed in the president's honor and was scheduled to be performed by the entire company after the main production as a kind of a patriotic encore. Major Rathbone, seated at the far end of the box, was the first to realize what had happened. I heard the discharge of a pistol behind me, and, looking round, saw through the smoke a man between the door and the president. At the same time, I heard him shout some word which I thought was freedom. Instantly towards him and seized him. Wrestling himself free, the shooter lunged at Rathbone's chest with a knife of considerable length. The major parried the blow, and the blade slid into the crook of Rathbone's left arm like a sword into a sheath, slicing through several inches of muscle between the elbow and shoulder. Rathbone managed only to snatch at the man's clothes as the shooter rushed toward the front of the box and vaulted over the rail. Below, the astonished, perhaps even delighted spectators watched a pale, dark-haired man make a cat-like 12-foot leap from the president's box to the stage, a portion of the American flag caught by his spur as he jumped, trailed like a banner behind him. Some witnesses heard the assassin shout, "Sic semper tyrannis," Latin for "thus always to tyrants," as he paused in the footlights with his knife held aloft before making his exit. Others reported the exclamation as revenge for the South. It was not the first time that pale, dark-haired man had been seen center stage. Several actors and spectators alike recognized him immediately as John Wilkes Booth, a member of one of America's most prominent families of actors. His presence now, in what seemed to be the most startling of cameo appearances, made no sense. Booth had timed his attack exquisitely. He knew the play, knew that the audience would be laughing the moment he pulled the trigger, that they would be put that be but a single actor on the stage who might attempt to intercept him as he fled. His plan worked nearly to perfection. In that brief moment of triumph, Booth had no better accomplices than astonishment and confusion. "Stop that man!" Major Rathbone cried from above. Only one member of the audience had the presence of mind to bound over the orchestra pit and pursue Booth as he dashed across the stage and out the rear door to the alley where his horse stood waiting. Up in the box, Rathbone peered through the gunpowder haze toward the president and understood at once that he was mortally wounded. Mary Lincoln's hand was on her husband's arm. Abraham Lincoln's eyes were closed. His chin drooped down to his chest. Miss Lincoln's scream finally pierced the confusion. At almost the same moment that John Wilkes Booth fired his pistol, an unexpected knock sounded at the door of the Lafayette Square home of Secretary of State William H. Seward. A 19-year-old black servant, William Bell, opened the door to find an imposing white man holding a small package in his left hand. His right hand was in his overcoat pocket. The fellow said he'd been sent by the secretary's physician, Dr. Verde, with a delivery of medication. That was no cause for alarm, since Secretary Seward was in considerable pain from the broken jaw and an arm he sustained in a carriage accident. But the courier's demeanor quickly put Bell on guard. The man insisted again and again that he could place the delivery into the hands of no one but Secretary Seward himself. William Bell was no fool. He knew better than to fall for any such thing. The secretary had been agitated and uncomfortable all day, and now that he was at last settled in bed, the entire household was keeping as quiet as possible so that he might sleep. Rest was vital to Secretary Seward, and no one would have known that better than Dr. Verde. "I told him I would not let him up," Bell said later, "but if he had any package of medicine for Mr. Seward, I would take it up and tell him how to take it. But that would not do. He must see him." Young though he was, Bell did not allow himself to be cowed by the suspicious white man who towered above him. Adamantly, Bell refused to permit the courier to disturb the secretary, even blocking his path bodily as the larger man began to bulldoze his way up the steps toward the family's bedrooms. I had spoken pretty rough to him, Bell admitted afterward. No small risk for a black man. Physically, though, William Bell was no match for the stranger. The best he could do was try to stall the fellow's ascent until another member of the household with more muscle or authority could come help. When he went up, he walked pretty heavily, Bell remembered, so heavily that Bell had to ask the man to tread more lightly. The thudding footsteps drew the Assistant Secretary of State, Frederick Seward, from the bedroom. Frederick met the man at the top of the steps, just outside his father's door, where a similar confrontation ensued over the medicine. The stranger doggedly insisted upon delivering it directly to the Secretary of State, and Frederick refused. Thinking to placate the messenger, Frederick opened his father's door just enough to peek inside. He's asleep, Frederick said. Just then the door opened again, and Frederick's teenage sister, Fanny, leaned out to say, "Fred, father is awake now." Nevertheless, Frederick would not budge. For 3 or 4 minutes, the two men repeated themselves. He made the impression on me of being rather a man dull of comprehension, Frederick recalled, for the courier offered no reason or excuse for his peculiar instructions. Finally, Frederick lost his patience entirely. "It is not worth while to talk any longer about it," he said. "You cannot see Mr. Seward. I will take the responsibility of refusing to let you see him. Go back and tell the doctor that I refuse to let you see him. If you think you cannot trust me with the message, well, if I cannot see him," the man mumbled and started down the stairs. "Don't walk so heavy," Mr. William Bell said, turning back to admonish him yet again. And that same instant, the man reached into the overcoat and drew a Navy issue revolver. There was no time for thought or reflection, Frederick Seward would later say. "I remember only thinking at the moment, there is an additional reason why he should not go in." The man pressed the gun to the assistant secretary's temple and squeezed the trigger. Time slowed to an otherworldly crawl for Frederick Seward. I remember noticing the shape of the pistol. The next instant I heard the click of the lock and then remember to have thought, well, the pistol has misfired. Undaunted, the assailant raised the malfunctioning weapon and smashed it into Frederick Seward's skull with such force that Frederick fell. He did not know whether he was reaching for the wall, the floor, or the stairs to brace himself. At the same time, his left hand rose instinctively to assess his wound. His fingertips found only a hole. William Bell dashed down the stairs and out the front door, hollowing "murderer" while the assailant crossed the hall toward his intended target. Inside Secretary Seward's bedroom, Private George Robinson, an Army nurse assigned to care for the secretary, heard the commotion and opened the door. A knife flashed twice before his eyes, and Robinson found himself knocked halfway over, bleeding from the face and forehead. The man slashed at Seward's face and neck with vicious determination, striking at least twice before Robinson could recover himself. As soon as I could get on my feet, I endeavored to haul him off the bed, and then he turned upon me. Fanny Seward screamed, awakening another brother, Major Augustus Seward, who came running from his own bedroom, finding two men grappling at the foot of his father's bed in the dim light of a single gas lamp. Augustus assumed his father was delirious and that the nurse was trying to subdue the restless secretary. Augustus leapt into the fray, grabbing the man he thought was his father, but said immediately on taking hold of him, "I knew from his size and strength that this was not." If his father was not delirious, it must have been the nurse who was delirious, Augustus surmised, and he proceeded to wrestle the unhinged man from the room. The intruder struck Augustus half a dozen times about the head and arms, all the time repeating intensely, if not loudly, "I'm mad, I'm mad." In the doorway, the brighter gaslight of the hallway allowed Augustus a glimpse of an entirely unfamiliar opponent, a large, beardless man with straight dark hair. On reaching the hall, Augustus remembered later, he gave a sudden turn and sprang away from me. The intruder shot down the stairs and out the front door, dropping his knife in a gutter as he fled on horseback. A scene of horror lay in his wake. Private Robinson was bleeding from the forehead and back. Major Augustus Seward's arms had been slashed 3 times. 2 of the wounds were bone deep. Assistant Secretary Frederick Seward lay insensible in a hallway, his skull fractured in at least 5 places and his brain exposed. He would not be able to speak more than a single syllable at a time for 3 weeks. But in the secretary's bedroom, a traumatized Fanny Seward discovered something akin to a miracle. Her father lay in a heap of bloodied sheets on the floor between the bed and the wall, alive. When Private Robinson had lunged at the attacker, the Secretary of State had rolled himself, broken bones and all, from his bed to the floor. His quick thinking had saved his life, but not before the assailant had managed to flay Seward's right cheek wide open and sink his knife into the right side of Seward's neck twice. "I'm not dead," he whispered to Fanny after he had been lifted back into the bed. "Send for the police and surgeon and close the house." Pandemonium erupted inside the Ford's Theater as the realization of what occurred ricocheted through the building. 2 men pounded on the outer door leading to the presidential box, while a voice from within begged them to stop. The assassin had barricaded the door behind him as he entered. Every attempt to break it open from the corridor only wedged the brace more firmly into its notch, making it impossible for Major Rathbone, who was himself bleeding profusely, to dislodge the brace. Rathbone soon pried the wooden brace free, and Charles Lee, a 23-year-old Army surgeon who had been seated in a dress circle, burst in. At the same time, another doctor had climbed to the stage floor, where he was being boosted up over the balustrade into the presidential box. Rathbone approached Leal with his left arm cradled in his right. The surgeon would later recall, beseeching me to attend to his wound. No one knew it yet, but Rathbone was in far more urgent need of a doctor than the president. Booth's knife had slashed through an artery. Blood streamed from the major's arm at a life-draining rate. Rather than examine the wound himself, Leal tipped Rathbone's chin upward and glanced into the major's eyes. Seeing no evidence of immediate danger, Leal shifted his attention to the president. "I grasped Mr. Lincoln's outstretched hand in mine," Lil recalled afterward, while she cried piteously, "Oh, doctor, is he dead? Can he recover? Will you take charge of him? Do you do what you can for him? Oh, my dear husband." Lil spoke soothingly to the distraught First Lady, assuring her that he would do everything in his power. He called for water and brandy, then set to work. What he saw was more encouraging. As I looked into Lincoln, he appeared dead. Dr. Lill later wrote, his eyes were closed and his head had fallen forward. He was being held upright in his chair by Miss Lincoln, who was weeping bitterly. There was no pulse. With the help of 3 other men who had entered the box, Lill laid Lincoln on the floor to examine him more fully. At first, no wound was evident. If not for the clot of blood Lil had spotted on the president's left shoulder, Lil might have concluded that he had simply nodded off. The flash of the dagger in Booth's hand as he fled and the blood dripping from Major Rathbone's arm led the surgeon to believe Lincoln had been stabbed. Dr. Lil ordered the president's collar and shirt to be cut open from the neck to elbow and found nothing, not a scratch, nor a drop of blood. Lil lifted Lincoln's eyelids. Immediately, the surgeon understood his error. The president's pupils showed undisputable signs of brain injury. I quickly passed the separated fingers of both hands through his blood-matted hair to examine his head and discovered the mortal wound. As Lil's fingers probed the hole, a clot dislodged and the president began to bleed. Then and there, Lil knew there was no hope for his commander-in-chief. The history of surgery fails the record to recovery from such a fearful wound, and I have never seen or heard of any other person with such a wound and injury to the sinus of the brain and the brain itself who lived even for an hour. Nevertheless, Dr. Lil cleared Lincoln's airway and stimulated his heart and lungs with external pressure, performing the Civil War era equivalent of CPR. Then a feeble action of the heart and irregular breathing followed. Dr. Lil had no hope of saving Lincoln's life, only of buying him enough time to die with the dignity befitting his office. The floor of a theater box was no place for a president to die, especially on Good Friday, and any attempt to transfer him to the White House would likely to end with Lincoln expiring in the street. And so within minutes of the shooting, the doomed Lincoln was conveyed on the shoulders of 2 doctors and 4 soldiers to a brick house diagonally across 10th Street from the theater. There he was laid crosswise upon a narrow bed. He had not shown any sign of consciousness since the instant the bullet had penetrated his skull. The wound was so unquestionably mortal that some newspapers began reporting the president as assassinated while he still lived. Though visibly wearied by 4 grueling years of civil war, Lincoln's body still possessed an uncanny physical strength. The bullet had plowed a 10 millimeter trench from one side of the president's brain to the other, extending from behind his left ear to the orbit of his right eye. And yet, all throughout that long night, his great and powerful heart still beat. His lungs continued to draw breath. Nearly 9 hours would pass before Lincoln succumbed. 5 seconds short of 7:22 a.m., April 15th, 1865, his final breath left his lips. 15 more seconds passed, and the president's pulse ceased forever. Hanged. We will continue chapter 3 next time.